I have the privilege today to sit down with John Dickson. And John Dickson is a person with a most fascinating CV. He's an academic historian. He has had positions at a number of universities in Australia and UK and is currently professor at Wheaton in the US. He's the author of many books. He is a producer of a number of films, and he is a very well-known podcaster. And today we are going to discuss the issue about evils in the Christian history, a subject that John Dickson has written about quite extensively. So warmly welcome, John.
Thank you, Stefan.
I'm looking forward to this discussion. So if we think about evils in the Christian history, why is that? It's kind of provocative theme. Why is that so important to deal with?
Well, we need to remember that Jesus thought everyone was evil. Right? So remember, Jesus said, if you who are evil know how to give good gifts, how much greater your Father. So we shouldn't be too shocked by the word evil. But I think what your question is getting at is why would Christians want to focus on a topic like that? And to me, there are a couple of reasons, at least. One is it's therapy. Mm-hmm. Christians know, without much detail, but they know there are some bad things in the closet of church history. Many bodies buried in the churchyard. And we can just sort of ignore them and hope they're not that meaningful, which may cause us to run into problems, or we can confront them, which is in a way like confronting our own demons as individuals. Confronting our weaknesses and foibles and sins is actually very healthy if you can find a way to know yourself better and improve. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second is that there is no doubt our friends who don't believe are asking the question. And so if we Christians are not prepared to know the evils of our own history, we'll be left exposed to anyone who has done a little bit of reading in church history. They'll be able to throw at you some awful stories. What will you do? Will you just deny them? I don't think that's appropriate. Will you get flustered? So, for the Christian, we need to be forearmed, as well as look into our own soul.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's always better to face the facts than to try to just ignore them. So if we think about people here in the West, thinking about religion, discussing religion, a lot of people would say that religion is doing more harm than good. And that includes Christianity, which is the religion most people in the West are familiar with. What would be your response to that kind of claim, religion do more harm than good? What are the evidence for that kind of view?
With such a large historical topic, no one's really going to be able to do the mathematics of more harm than good. And so it's really, a statement like that is really just a sentiment, a feeling that Christianity has done great wrong, wrong for which it shouldn't be forgiven, wrong for which it shouldn't be trusted. And you're right that a lot of people think that. Ipsos poll surveyed 20 countries and found that Belgium has 68% of people agreeing with the statement that religion does more harm than good. 68%. They're number one. Number two was Australia, Spain and Germany, with 63% saying religion does more harm than good. Right down to, say, the US, it's just 4 in 10. That's still a lot for what people still say is the greatest Christian country. So there's lots in Christian history that lends support to this. People think of the Inquisitions, people think of the Crusades. If people know a little more about history, they could even say the killing of Hypatia in the early 5th century. Christians killed the greatest philosophical woman in the world. They could say Charlemagne ran around Saxony with a Christian jihad, forcing people at sword point to be baptized. So there's lots of evils in Christian history, but they could just as easily look at child sexual abuse. And I mean, this is probably a particular issue in Belgium, where in the Belgian consciousness, the sexual abuse of priests and the cover-ups has been exposed to such a degree that when Ipsos poll came around to asking Belgians what they thought, I think they got the wrath of the Belgian attitude. So I'm of the view that Christians' first instinct should be to admit all of this stuff, not hide from it, because we don't believe the secular myth that we're good through and through. That's not our doctrine. That's the secular doctrine. Our doctrine is our heart is wicked. We're made in the image of God. We're capable of doing great and glorious things, but there's a darkness through the heart of everyone. And it was Jesus, after all, who said to his own disciples, take the log or plank out of your eye rather than looking at the speck in someone else's eye. And to me, that teaching gives Christians permission to look at the log in the eye of the Christian church in the present or in the past.
You started out by saying no one can really do the mathematics of is religion doing more harm than good, and I think that's a really important point. It's like saying has politics done more harm than good? Yeah. So it's kind of an inevitable fact of human existence. You have religious beliefs, you're forced to have political. So it's kindly wrongly framed question. And then you have mentioned, so instead of having this general perspective, religion, universally, one needs to go into the specifics. Yeah. And now you have mentioned here now a number of specifics related to the Christian faith that we need to face up and be honest about. So then, how can we do that, really look honestly into the failure of us as Christians and our predecessors within the church, without feeling that Christianity in itself is a failure or is inherently evil? Okay. What would you say?
Two things. One, we begin with this motif that I just mentioned, that we already know that we are dark, that we are poor in spirit. And there is a blessing in admitting that you're poor in spirit, that your soul is bankrupt. Because then you won't be so shocked by the bad behavior of Charlemagne or the anti-Semitism of blessed Martin Luther. You will lament, you will mourn, but you won't be shocked. So that's the starting point. The second piece for the Christian must be to constantly look at Jesus and compare Martin Luther with Jesus, compare Charlemagne with Jesus, compare the murderers of Hypatia in the 5th century with Jesus. Because the way I think of it is, Jesus wrote a beautiful melody that is the world's greatest melody. And, at its core, it is love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who mistreat you. Because that's not just an ethic, that's the gospel. That's Christ's self-giving on the cross for his enemies. So the gospel and the gospel teaching are the melody. So when we read of Martin Luther recommending the killing of Jewish rabbis who dare to teach the Talmud, we've got to ask ourselves, is that the tune that Jesus gave us to sing? Is that the beautiful melody? And the answer is no. And everyone can tell no. And this is why our skeptical friends are so quick to judge us, because they know as well that Jesus didn't write that melody. Jesus asked us to love our enemies and do good to those who hate us. So what the Christian needs to do is stay very close to the person of Jesus himself and recognize his beautiful melody, while noting that sometimes Christians have performed the melody spectacularly, beautifully. And hopefully we'll get to talk about some of that.
Yeah.
But it also means that Christians have gone out of tune when they've taken their eyes off the Jesus of the Gospels. That for me is the key. And being a historian and having to confront so much darkness, actually hasn't depressed me. It's sent me back to Jesus, to cling to Jesus and to cry out to him to keep me from my blind spots, to enlighten me. Because the scariest thought is, Martin Luther, he couldn't see that he was doing something wrong in his anti-Semitism. That's astonishing. Charlemagne couldn't see that he was doing something wrong by converting the Saxons at the end of the sword. So I must have blind spots too. So my reading of church history forces me to be humble and actually ask myself, what will they be saying about Stefan and John 100 years from now that I can't see, but they will be able to see? And this doesn't excuse Martin Luther or Charlemagne or anything, but it puts me in with them as potentially blind unless I cling to the gospel of Jesus.
It was a beautiful illustration you gave with from the musical world of the melody and being tuned in, or I think that's really helpful, and the fact that non-Christians, even with quite little knowledge about the Christian faith, they know that the horror that has happened within Christian history is not a reflection that comes out from Jesus Christ.
Yes.
So very helpful.
I mean, Jesus makes us look bad. And,
yeah,
and our friends who aren't Christians, they know that.
Yeah.
But on this very point, before you move to your next question, there's this amazing quote at the end of an early 20th century essay by Albert Einstein, when he was asked his opinion of the war, First World War. And he wrote this essay against German Christian nationalism. He ends the essay by saying, "But why so many words when I can say it in just a few, words that are very appropriate to me as a Jew? Follow your Master Jesus Christ, not just in your words and songs, but foremost in your deeds." Full stop.
Wow.
So here is the smartest man in the world telling us the problem with violent Christians isn't their Christianity. It's their departure from their master. That to me is a beautiful insight that our friends who are skeptical and Christians need to remember.
So obviously it's not religion as such that is the problem, and you have already touched on it. So how would you define the problem we are faced with?
The human heart. The human heart. There's a log in the eye of us all. There's a log in the eye of the church, and the church should be the quickest to acknowledge that. We should be the first to admit fault. But there's a log in the eye of us all. And you only need to compare, let's just take one example. The Spanish Inquisition is often put forward as the most horrible, bloody thing that the church would always do if it had power. Now, we know from very detailed records that the Spanish Inquisition, over its 350 years, killed about 6,000 people. Now, which is 6,000 people too many, okay? It's terrible. I'm no fan of the Spanish Inquisition. But the French Revolution killed 3 times as many people in 9 months. In the terror of 1793-94, they executed over 17,000 people in the name of what? Not religion. Secular liberty, equality, fraternity. So this tells us the problem isn't religion or irreligion. It's the human heart. in possession of a passion that is unrestrained by a beautiful melody.
In one sense, a lot of people think of that as a depressing analysis, and a lot of people would like to say what the current Pope recently said in an interview, that human beings are fundamentally good, and that it gives a good feeling to say that. But there's such an interesting explanatory power in this analysis of human beings, that we all are messed up on the inside in this way. It's not an excuse for anything, not least for what Christians have done, but there is something really close to truth.
It is explanatory, yes, but even more than that, I actually think it is encouraging and uplifting. My reason is this. Imagine if I believed I'm good through and through, and I tried to convince myself of that. Well, by about 9 a.m. each day, I have contrary evidence to deal with. How would I get through my day thinking I'm constantly disproving my thesis that I'm fundamentally good? I'd much rather know that I am a selfish being at my core. Yes, I'm capable of love at my core, but it's messy right at the core. When I know that, it actually allows me to be a little kinder to myself, a little less shocked, and quicker to seek remedy, quicker to admit fault. Because the problem of thinking I'm good is when the counter evidence comes, I was angry with my wife this morning, that sort of thing, I can sort of downplay it because I'm good. No, but if I know to expect that I am a jerk, then I'll be quicker to admit fault. There's something liberating about the Christian doctrine of the fallenness of humanity.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. So if we move from a general picture here and look at the history of the Christian Church, how can we distinguish between kind of genuine Christianity, true Christianity, from historical outliers? How can we know what is a true representation of Christianity?
Well, again, I come back to the melody, which is found in the Gospels. Jesus Christ himself. That's the true Christian. Okay. And you might think, well, that's a high bar. Yes, that's the point. Everyone's disappointing after Jesus. But what it means is, throughout Christian history, you often find these cycles of Christians moving away from the melody and then being called back. And this wasn't just a thing that happened in the 16th century, the Reformation that we love. The whole idea of Reformation is built into Christianity. Take the log out of your eye, then you'll see clearly. So there's built into Christianity a self-corrective mechanism that you find from the beginning almost. I mean, Saint Jerome in the late 4th, early 5th century is castigating wealthy priests who have just got into the priesthood so that they could meet with young women in their homes. Okay, so what we have there is evidence that already in the 4th, 5th century, people were becoming ministers to hang out with women. But you've got a prophet in Jerome castigating them, writing against them, saying, "How dare you?" Now, right there, you've got the worst and the best. But it's clear to anyone what is the true Christian, the true Christian path. I've mentioned Charlemagne a couple of times. I mean, it's very well known that he forced the Saxons to convert at the end of a sword. But what is less well known is that one of his chief courtiers was Alcuin of York, a wonderful deacon in the church, a great theologian. He wrote 2 letters to court, one to the court generally and one to Charlemagne himself, begging for Charlemagne's policy to return to the old method of persuasion only. You can't make a real Christian at the end of a sword. And you know what? That had an effect, because the very next year after Alcuin's letters, Charlemagne softened his policy against the pagans. So right there we see the departure from Christians and the reformer bringing it back. We could step into the 10th and 11th centuries when the church of the south of France was beginning to get wealthy. And Odo of Cluny pipes up and he's reading his Gospels and he realizes we're all probably going to hell. We're worse than unbelievers with our wealth, he said. And in a matter of 10 years, he was given the authority to reform all of the monasteries of Europe, bring them back into line with a more gospel focus, with a simple approach. What I'm saying is, Christians, the church is made up of good eggs and bad eggs. But the glorious thing is, in every age, God raises up reformers to call people back to the gospel.
We started out with the question, does religion do more harm than good? And we've said, for a Christian, it's really important to be honest about the bad things that have been done in the name of Christ. But we shouldn't shy away from the good things that have come out from the preaching of the gospel and through the Christian church. What kind of positive influences would you like to mention in terms of the Christian faith?
Yes, I think so long as we're willing to very quickly admit fault, we should also feel free to talk about the beautiful contributions. And the way I often put this to my more skeptical friends is the interesting question isn't, have Christians participated in all the evils common to humanity? That's not an interesting question. You're just asking, are Christians human too? The answer is yes. But no one can say Christians invented warfare or torture or bigotry. The Greeks and Romans were doing well on torture and warfare and bigotry long before the Christians came along. So that's an uninteresting question. What's the interesting question? What is the unique contribution of Christianity to our world? Certainly Christians didn't bring warfare or torture or bigotry. So that's not it. What is the unique thing? I think it has to be putting love at the center of ethics. Absolutizing the ethic of love. This was unknown in Greece and Rome, unknown in Egypt and Babylon, unknown in Gaul and Saxony. The death of Jesus supercharged the Jewish love ethic. Jews had taught, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus insisted the neighbor now includes the enemy, the Gentile, the leper. And putting that doctrine at the very center, and not just an arbitrary ethic, his whole life course was love of enemy. He gave his life on a cross for his enemies. So the central gift of Christianity to the West is to move love to the very center of the ethical conversation. And our world was utterly transformed by that. We could talk example after example. We know that the very first public charitable programs were invented by the church. Now everyone will say, but the emperors opened the grain silos during times of famine. Yes, but only for citizens who were the minority in Rome. So the non-citizens who didn't have their badge couldn't get any grain. It was really just, the emperors were really just trying to guarantee peace and order. The poor, the really poor, had to flee the city. Christians said, no, our welfare is free for everyone. And already by the 250s, they had established welfare programs, food programs for hundreds and hundreds of people in Rome. Or think of hospitals. Sure, there were hospitals in the armies of the Roman Empire, but if you were a poor person who'd broken your leg, you couldn't go to the army hospital. It was Basil the Great, and then Fabiola of Rome, just 20 years later, who established the first public hospitals that we know of in world history. And now we take it for granted. And the beautiful, there's still a beautiful symbol of this in Paris. You know, one of the great hospitals of Paris is the Hôtel Dieu, the Hostel of God, started in the 9th century by Christians. And the very name of the hospital gives away its Christian origins. It's now a very secular hospital, right? There's no God there at all, but it's still called the Hostel of God because this was just part of hundreds of hospitals. All of them started by Christians. Why? Because they moved love to the center of ethics.
That's so fascinating. I think like 100 years ago, a lot of Westerners, also non-Christians, still had a knowledge of the positive contribution of Christianity in terms of healthcare and in terms of education, in terms of science, in terms of the legal system, and could admire that input that has come from Christianity. My experience today is that fewer and fewer people in the West knows about that and understands that connection. I don't know what your experience is.
I agree. I mean, part of it is the child sexual abuses, I think, have just covered the whole of Christian history with a dark cloud. So it's almost impossible for people to even be motivated to look back to the starting of hospitals because of this very recent catastrophe. The other reason is people have stopped studying history, I'm ashamed to say. I mean, there are studies on the decline of history, the decline of humanities generally, but the decline of history as a subject. So people are just completely ignorant of what gave us the West. People imagine that it was Thomas Jefferson who invented freedom of religion, or John Locke who invented equality, or something like this. It's nuts. And no one who knows the medieval world could imagine that, because the medieval canon law talks all about equality, human rights, the rights of the poor against the rich, and so on. It's a very interesting writer on this, Luke Ferry, who is an atheist. He's the former education minister for France and a professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne. And his little book, what's it called? A Short History of Ideas, I think, A Brief History of Ideas. His chapter on Christianity is remarkable. And he says, we have a loss of historical knowledge today that is a crying shame, for we no longer know that it was Jesus and the early church that gave us the doctrine of equality, that gave us democracy, that even gave us the rights of man. For a Frenchman who is an atheist to say that, it's remarkable. So I always recommend my students read that book. It's a wonderful book, but the chapter on Christianity, because here is a leading atheist calling modern people to an understanding of history that says, the fact is, Christianity gave us most of what we love in ethics today, even though he doesn't believe it's true, which I think is a very interesting conversation starter. How can we love the ethic without believing the thing that gave us the ethic? Or another way of putting it is, how can we ground the ethic? We might love the ethic, but how can you put love at the center of the ethical conversation if at the center of the universe there is just chaos? I'd love to sit in a room with Luke Ferry and ask him, but I probably won't get that opportunity.
Well, why not? We should try to put you in the same room.
It would be a joy.
Yeah, it's been a joy to have had this conversation with you, John. I'm so thankful. It's been really stimulating, and I think we can clearly see the calling to be really honest about history, about the truth about history, but also have a courage to show our culture all the good fruits that have come out from the Christian faith.
Yes.
And I thank you especially for the focus you've had on the person of Jesus, the melody that is sung through history that comes from him.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I love the topic. Bless you.